On May 6, 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts, 99-year-old Betty Paris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams followed several women from their village to the outskirts of Salem where they were captured. They were taken inside a barn
and witnessed something that had never before been recorded in North America. Black Mass before making their harrowing escape. What they witnessed over the span of 2 days scarred them for life. 20 years later, in a leather-bound journal, Betty wrote down the appalling events that took place during those days. She kept the journal a secret until a week before her death, at which point she handed it down to her son, Thomas. Before his death, he passed it down to his children, where it stayed. Welcome to DarkWrought Legends. Where fear takes form and shadows tell their stories. Let's begin. In the family for generations until finally coming to light in 1936. These are the events from those 2 days. It's been transcribed to modern day English. As I write this, the year is 1712. I've often asked myself why I never told anyone what happened to Abigail and I during those days in 1990. To my father pressed me for quite some time to tell him what happened and where we were when we disappeared, but the words could never escape my lips even when I received lashings. Perhaps it was some sort of sorcery stopping me, or maybe it was too frightening to speak out loud. Writing it down in this journal seems to be the only way I'm able to reveal the grim details of those days. I always seemed to be wise beyond my years, and growing up my father would tell me I was an old soul in a young body. Whispered talk of witches had been going on for months in the village, to the point everyone was beside themselves. Not long after, we were told by the magistrate to make witch bottles for protection and hide them somewhere in our house and property. The magistrate also said not to drink from the wells for fear they were poisoned. I remember one day watching my little brother about to take a drink straight from the wells bucket after our father had specifically forbidden us not to. Father came barging out of nowhere, knocked bucket from his hands, then gave him the worst lashings I'd ever seen my father render, being the adventurous type. Abigail and I were we'd been secretly planning a way to find out who the witches were and expose them. It so happened a week before May 6, as I met up with Abigail one early morning to help her with her outside chores, we noticed Sarah, Dustin, Alice, Parker and Amputator leaving the village and not return until late evening. Even though we were quite young back then, we could tell by their mannerism something was amiss with them. This happened several more times, so we decided we would follow them on the waiting though, and didn't want to leave her alone, so I continued opening the door the rest of the way. As it continued creaking, I slowly crept outside and was able to close the door without making another sound. I then hurriedly put on my boots and ran to her house. When I made it there, she was already outside waiting. I told her about the door making noise as we locked arms and started making our way to the place they met up each morning, which just so happened to be a well on the edge of town. When we got there, we picked what we thought was a good hiding spot. We were also early and would have to wait for a spell. It was cold as we sat there huddled behind Captain John Alden's fence, and we both started shivering. I was worried we wouldn't be able to tolerate it anymore when, seemingly out of nowhere, Alice showed up. I nudged Abigail, who was starting to doze off, and whispered to her to be prepared to move as soon as Sarah and showed up. It wasn't long before they came walking by the fence we were actually hiding behind, almost spotting us as they did. Luckily, the weeds were big enough and shielded us from being seen. I remember looking up through the weeds and seeing the sinister look of joy Anne had on her face. I can still see it in my mind to this day. They stood around the well talking for a bit, then suddenly turned and started walking down the road that led out of the village, heading towards the Proctor farm, which was somewhat far for us back. Then we waited until they were almost out of sight before we stood up, crawled through the fence, and began following them. It was beginning to get light as we trail behind them. Part of our plan was to stay just off the road, hidden in the trees in case they happened to turn around. This was clever thinking because every so often they did in fact stop and look behind them, checking to see if they were being followed. A while later, Proctor's large barn came into view as we watched them walk up to the barn stores, pause, look around, then go inside. There was a patch of thick bushes that sat on the side of the barn, so we decided to sneak our way over there. Once there, we quickly huddled down to stay out of sight. As we sat there waiting, my mind started to wander. I remember looking down at the witch's bottle in my hand I'd brought. I rolled it around, watching the urine, blood, rosemary, and rusty nails go back and forth, wondering if it would actually protect me should I need it. Something then jolted me out of my thoughts when I heard what sounded like snoring. I looked over and smirked at Abigail, who'd fallen asleep, when suddenly someone grabbed my hair, yanked me to the ground, and began pulling me along. Abigail was also being pulled alongside me as I kicked and fought to break free. I looked up and could see it was Old Man Proctor. As this young girls called him, his face had this look of anger I'd never seen from him before. This sent panic surging through me. He dragged us inside the barn, let go, then turned and slammed the door shut. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness when I heard a woman's voice from somewhere say I was right. I knew you nosy little girls were following us. I was still clutching the witch's bottle, so I sat up, got into a kneeling position, and lifted it high in the air, showing the woman who was talking. Foolish child, do you really think those things work on us? She said as she menacingly laughed. A wave of terror overcame me as I lowered my arm. I'd had my doubts it would work, but was now certain it would not. Old Man Proctor grabbed our hair again and started dragging us to the other side of the barn, throwing us against the wall. As he let go, he motioned to us to sit on some chairs that were nearby while he went and grabbed some rope to tie us up. As he was tying up Abigail, I glanced over and we locked eyes. She looked as if her soul had been taken. The sun was starting to come through a crack in the barn. As it shined on Old Man Proctor, I noticed a black mark in the center of his forehead. There was black liquid oozing from it, almost like it was blood, but it was clearly not blood. Once he finished tying us up, he walked off into a dark part of the barn and out of sight. We saw no one for quite some time, only the sounds of whispering coming from the dark corners of the barn. It went on for the longest time and seemed to be from all directions, all around us. It was the strangest thing. I think it was late afternoon when I saw Alice emerge from the dark as she walked towards us. When she got close, I immediately noticed the same black mark on her forehead as Old Man Proctor. It was a dire mistake, you girls following us here. You should have left well enough alone. She said I was always stronger than Abigail, so I spoke up. You need to burn with you first, little one, she said as she laughed. She then turned and walked back to where she came from, still laughing as she did. As night settled in, we started hearing a lot of movement in the barn and also outside. I got the sense something big was going to happen. Without warning, everything went quiet. The barn doors creaked as they were slowly opened, and then what sounded like an animal walking, the sound of fire being started, and caught my attention. And not long after the room lit up, I gasped as there before us were 13 women by my count, most of whom I knew. I noticed they all had the same black marks on their foreheads as Alice and Old Man Pro. They were standing in a circle, and in the middle was the largest black goat I'd ever seen. It was as black as coal. There was something in the middle of the goat's head between its horns. I couldn't make out at first. It wasn't until one of the women who was holding a torch went over and lit the black candle that was sitting there. Each of the women, one by one, then walked over to the goat and lit a candle they were holding from the candle on its head. As this was going on, the goat had its eyes fixated on us. This is not a normal goat. There's something ungodly about it, I thought to myself. I could hear Abigail crying, and it was then I would have done anything Not to be there, I wished I would have talked myself into going back to bed. When the door at my house first started creaking, when they were done lighting their candles, they again formed a circle, bowed their heads and crossed themselves. I noticed they used their left hand instead of their right, which was strange to me because I was strictly told no matter what I must always use my right hand when making the sign of the cross. Right then the whispering started again, only this time it was faster and darker than before. The goat started moving his head up and down as it continued looking at us. I was so scared I had to look away, as did Abigail. Sometime later they blew out their candles and left. That first night was cold and dreary as we were left tied to the chairs we slept off and on, but also talked about things and even discussed yelling for help, but decided not to make our captors angry. I thought about how our families must be fret over finding us. We'd get the switch for sure, but I didn't care. I'd take any beating as long as we made it out of the barn alive. All was quiet as morning came and went. It wasn't until late afternoon we again heard rumblings outside. When it got dark, the barn doors opened and in came the same women from the previous day, all dressed in black robes, each carrying an already lit candelabra. This time they again formed a circle and set down their candelabras. Soon after, old man Proctor entered the barn carrying a black dossel. He went inside the circle, spread it out, then left. No sooner had he left, he came back with a rope in his left hand leading a pig behind him. He brought the pig to the center and tied the rope to a beam above him. He then left the barn, closing the doors behind him. As the strange whispering started again, it wasn't long before the large black goat suddenly appeared from the dark. It stared at us as it walked towards the women, raising each leg as high as it could, then slamming its hoof onto the ground as if in anger. When it got close to the pig, it instantly went berserk, trying to run away. Its squeals were the most god-awful. The goat put its head down and started ramming the pig in its side. This went on before the goat finally impelled its horns into the pig, twisting its head back and forth as its squeals echoed through the barn. The women looked as if they were reaving in the GRL that was unfolding before us. When the goat removed its horns from the pig's side, blood came squirting out. Only the blood wasn't red like it should be. It was as black as the goat. The women then removed their black robes, letting them fall to the ground, revealing their unclothed bodies. They swiftly moved in, showering themselves in the blood as they rubbed it over their entire body. The goat again turned its gaze to us as this was all going on. "Are we going to die?" whispered Abigail. "Yes, we may," I replied as I locked eyes with the goat. Once the women were completely covered in blood, they knelt down and began worshipping the goat. This went on for a long time before the goat suddenly walked over to us. We closed our eyes and turned our heads. As it got near, I could feel and smell its horrible breath. As it got right next to my face, I tried my hardest not to scream or cry as I prayed for it to just leave it, then went over to Abigail and did the same thing before turning and walking towards the barn's doors. As they opened by themselves, the women stood up, picked up their candelabras and followed the goat as it left. Everything then went black. The only light was from the stars. We sat there for a while as I noticed how weak I was, having not eaten or drank anything for several days. I lowered my head in despair, knowing we were most likely going to die, when I heard a girl's voice softly whisper from the dark, "Betty." "Abigail." I lifted my head and thought I recognized that voice. She then said our names again. "Betty." "Abigail." I knew right then it was Elizabeth Hubbard, or as we called her, Lizzie. "Lizzie, come free us," I said, just loud enough so she'd hear. I could then hear her tiptoeing through the barn, coming towards us. "How did you find us?" I whispered as she came up and started untying us. "I actually followed you here the first morning, but ended up inside the Proctor house, hiding under his bed until I was finally able to get out," she replied. "Where are they now?" I asked. "I don't know." It went quiet for a while and I knew it was my chance to get out. I watched you get captured and taken into the barn by old man Proctor, so I knew I had to stay and help you, she replied. Once she freed us, we tried standing up, but it was difficult because we've been sitting for so long, so she helped us stand and walk through the barn. As we passed the dead pig, I could smell its horrible stench. When we made it to the barn's doors, we stuck our heads out, making sure they were nowhere in sight. When it looked safe, we started walking back towards the village as fast as we could, given our lack of strength. Along the way, we discussed if we should keep the horrible things we'd seen a secret. We were just too scared at the time to reveal what really happened in that barn, never telling anyone. We did let everyone know we'd seen them acting like witches and accused them of being such, which they were. Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and Elizabeth Hubbard did accuse the women they had recognized at the Proctor farm as being witches. They were sentenced to death and executed. Altogether, more than 200 people were accused in the Salem Witch Trials. 30 people were found guilty, 19 of whom were executed by hanging, 14 women and 5 men when witch phobia was at its peak. From 1400 to 1775, it's estimated that around 40,000 to 100,000 people worldwide were executed after being accused of witchcraft, with 80% being women. For more scary horror stories, thank you for joining DarkWrought Legends. Subscribe for more tales of terror.